Well, thanks very much, Andy, for that glowing introduction. And thanks for organizing this. It's a bit belated, but one can't argue with the Icelandic volcano. What I'm going to deal with is argument, not because I dislike rhetoric, far from it, or imagery or poetic matters, but because I think that the argumentation that you have in the Madhyamaka is not straightforward and is often a much more complex matter than people make it out to be, Buddhists included. I'm going to pursue it from a rather odd angle, perhaps, which is, I think, one way to look at what's going on with the argumentation is to look at how many arguments they have and how many arguments they need to have. In other words, instead of putting the emphasis on the quality of the argumentation, let's look at the quantity. And I think that that has a certain revealing aspect which it brings out, in a sense, a premise that I have, but it also indirectly, I hope, corroborates it. A methodological premise, which is that there's a historical evolution in the Madhyamaka, that things aren't frozen, that there are fundamental or important changes that happen over time, changes in context, changes in approach. That's not to say that if things aren't frozen, that somehow or another later philosophers are deforming things or are not faithful and so on. No, it may even be possible that later philosophers are more interesting than Nagarjuna. And in fact, in some respects, I think they are. If we want to look at the merits of it, which I won't go into too much, as I say, I'm more interested in pursuing this question of the quantity of argumentation. But if we want to look at the merits of it, then the debate is open too. The fact that there are changes doesn't necessarily mean that this is some kind of falsification or some kind of discrediting. So there's a historical premise here. There's the idea that, in a sense, the Madhyamaka, like all things composite, changes. Seems like a banal premise, but in some sense, it's not banal, at least for a lot of people's approach to Madhyamaka philosophy. It seems as if they've adopted the contrary principle of things having to be rigid. In any case, let's look at what I see to be some of the evolution, and I can't go into all the ways to be a Madhyamaka. I'll just go into some. Now, I think the first thing that impresses one in the case of Nagarjuna and the commentators more or less up to, say, Chandrakirti, is the quantity of argumentation. That is, we seem to have a knockdown, drag-out battle on every possible issue that could come up at that time. The major metaphysical issues, the major metaphysical debates, whether it's the functioning of perception, of vision, whether it's questions of causality and so forth, these are discussed in a great deal of detail with a great deal of argumentation. And the question is, did they need all that much argumentation? Was it actually all necessary? Well, let's suppose that it was. In other words, that they weren't, in a sense, simply engaged in overkill, or that they weren't just simply pursuing an approach of exhausting exhausting the opponent until he said uncle. Let's suppose that, that there is a reason for having a lot of argumentation at the time of Nagarjuna. What would that reason be? What would his approach be? What kind of approach would necessitate that one, in a sense, argues a lot? Well, I think if we look at it in that way, I think we get Nagarjuna as looking rather much like a certain type of skeptic who is allowing for people, or in a sense challenging people, to provide arguments, provide theses, provide positions, and who is countering them with arguments of equal force, isotenia, in order to arrive finally at a certain type of thesislessness, which of course in the case of the skeptics is ataraxia. There are important differences from the skeptic in that we're not simply saying that we don't know or that we have no way of knowing. In the case of Nagarjuna, he's also saying that there are arguments for saying that such and such is not the case. And of course, he has his idea that we're proving voidness, not just simply our incapacity to know. Now, let's just take a couple of examples of a certain type of argumentation that we find in Nagarjuna. It's, of course, things that you know. But I want to take these examples so that, that I can, in a sense, do something different with them later. Let's take basically something that would involve a banal statement like vases exist. Okay, we have a premise, vases exist. We have a Madhyamaka who comes along and he says, well, if they exist, then they must bear one of the 5 or 7 types of relations to their parts. This is, of course, the Namnga Rikpa you find in Nagarjuna, or the Namdungi Rikpa that you would find in Chandrakirti. And then we go through a more detailed explanation on the 5 or of the 7 to show that they don't. Vases don't stand in any of those relationships to their parts. And then we have a conclusion, which is something along the line that we can paraphrase in this way. Therefore, they, that is the vases, don't really, or don't in fact, or don't actually exist. They just seem to. Now, of course, the interesting word here is really, actually, and in fact. It's more or less my rough and ready translation of svabhavena, paramartatas, something like that, in truth, dimpa, and so forth. What's to be noticed is that that phrase figures in the conclusion, but not clearly or not at all in the premises. So we can take another type of argument. Sprouts exist. The Madhyamaka says, then they must be produced from causes like seeds that are identical with them, different from them both, or from no cause. And none of these 4 scenarii can be the case. Therefore, sprouts don't really, don't in fact, don't actually exist, but just seem to. And then we might have somebody who says, oh, there are then, perhaps he says, or perhaps he just says right from the beginning, there are no sprouts, vases, and so forth. To which the Madhyamaka will come back with another counter-argument, at least my Madhyamaka reconstruction of Nagarjuna, and he'll say, then activities, speech, and thought about such things would be impossible. And then he would say, but there are these activities. And so he would arrive at the conclusion that it's not really, actually, or in fact so, that there are no sprouts, seeds, vases, and so forth. Now, in that type of situation, in that type of argumentation, one can always say, but have you exhausted all the possibilities? You had 5 possibilities with the parts-whole relationship. How do you know there aren't more? In fact, your own commentator said there were 7. How do you know there aren't 10? How do you know that there aren't other kinds of argumentation that you need? In a sense, there's no end to that process. There's no master argument which will short-circuit the whole thing and give you a definitive result. You have to keep on arguing. You have to, in a sense, keep arguing with anybody who tosses anything out to you. It's a type of an invitation to bring it on. And what and who you will be arguing will vary from time and place. In other words, certain things will be hot-button issues at a certain time. They'll be formulated in a certain way. 2,000 years later, things may be very, very different. There'll be other issues. Certain things may then no longer be, in a sense, disputed. They'll be taken as common sense. It's interesting to see, for example, in the case of the Greeks, that they did have skeptical debates about atomic theory. We could argue that now, if we were being skeptics, we would say, well, there's enough of a consensus on that. We're not going to have skeptical argumentation about it. We're just, in a sense, going to leave it unanalyzed. The parallel with Madhyamaka is obvious. Now, I see time is moving along.
I'm going to pause it 1 second, just tell you this, that...
So, yeah, in the case of Nagarjuna and our parallel with this, the skeptic, I think there's the interesting feature is that we can imagine a necessity for having all the chapters of the Madhyamaka Karakas. In a sense, he did have to deal with people who are abhidharmikas in that time. He had to deal with people who are logicians. He had to deal with Nyayikas. He had to deal with certain people who had a type of common sense realism. I think it mirrors, it reflects pretty well the situation of actual and possible opponents and objections. In other words, what was on the cards at that time. A Nagarjuna, or that type of a Nagarjunian approach nowadays, would also necessitate a whole lot of arguments. A whole lot of arguments. I'm not going to write that hypothetical book, but it would necessitate a whole lot of arguments against philosophers, perhaps some against some scientists, I'm not sure, on certain things. But it would not be, in a sense, reducible to 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 types of master arguments which one could just use against everybody constantly. You'd have to take what was on the cards, what were hot issues at the particular, in the modern period, and a Madhyamaka would have to deal with that, providing counter-arguments. I think one of the interesting things also that you see, to go back to the question of, say, for example, positions on physical matters or on what we would call scientific matters, is that we see in the case of Nagarjuna that stuff like, for example, the functioning of the eye, optics, and so forth, becomes a Madhyamaka issue. The question of whether or not we have prapyakartvavada, in other words, functioning by contact. Is there something that goes between my eye and the object, or not? Is there action at a distance? This becomes for a Madhyamaka a big debate. And it's not just for the Madhyamikas, it's a kind of a pan-Indian debate, and the Madhyamikas exploit that type of thing. In other words, what they do is they tend to play off the prapyakartvavada, refute the prapyakartvavadan with his opponent, that is the aprapyakartvavadan. Use the opponent's arguments against him, and then they'll change the tables. They'll use the functioning by contact against a guy who's advocating action at a distance. So there's a feature that one sees in this, which is that in this type of an approach too, that not just is there a whole lot of argumentation, but there's a kind of opportunism. Everything is grist for the Madhyamaka mill, and it's all fair game. You can use an argument for, say, functioning at a distance against functioning by contact, or vice versa. So there are a lot of pan-Indian debates which can be integrated into the Madhyamaka and used in his special way. Okay, now let's move on to what I take to be a different type of argumentation. An argumentation which is much more like a series of master arguments. By the time we get to Bhava Viveka, or Bha Viveka as we call him now, ever since Ejima, we start to speak of 4 great reasons. Sometimes people speak of 5. Well, 4 or 5. The irresistible feeling is that, hey, we're getting something close to the 5 ways of St. Thomas. Or at least that kind of argument, that kind of thing which could be perhaps trotted out in a scholastic context of providing a master argument, a type of a proof. And which will, in a sense, not be an argument ad hoc or ad personam, but irrespective of the adversary and his positions, it will be utilizable. In other words, it's not designed personally or specifically in function of the actual beliefs of the opponent. Whatever those beliefs might be, this argument or these arguments are considered to work. They become, especially in the hands of Svatantrika, types of proofs. And the other type of thing that's extremely important in this is that we start to see a greater and greater separation of the two truths. In other words, if we go back to our arguments that I presented earlier as being typical Nagarjunian arguments, of course we still have these arguments, but they're formulated explicitly or implicitly at least, not just simply as vases exist, and if they exist, then they must bear one of the 5 or 7 possible relations to their parts and so forth, but something along the line of vases really exist. If they really exist, then they must really bear one of the 5 or 7, perhaps, real relations to their real parts, and so on. And they don't really stand in one of those or in any of those 5 or 7 relations to their parts, and then the conclusion is they don't really exist. So everywhere in the argumentation, implicitly or explicitly, we start to have a reliance on a qualifier. We start to introduce a qualifier, which I'm calling really, and of course the Sanskrit is again paramatatas, satyatas, Dempa in Tibetan, Ranshingi, Svabhavena, and so forth. Now, did Kamalashila exactly do that? Was he explicit on that? Perhaps not as explicit as I'm making him out to be. But certainly, did Kamalashila or Bhava Viveka do this? Certainly, they did add qualifications, and they were taken to task, or it became a philosophical issue, but what we have to do with these qualifications. Now, one of the things that you accomplish by putting in qualifications is that you can say, you can make a split between an argument about vases really existing and really bearing one of the 5 or 7 relationships and so forth, and the conventional statement about vases. Vases exist. vases are one or many, vases are caused by potters and clay and so forth like this. In other words, we make a separation between the truths. And this, of course, was a very, very important development. That's an advantage. But there's also, or a seeming advantage, there's also a downside or a complicated thing to this, which is that the argumentation, the type of argumentation that you're getting on this is changing fundamentally. In other words, you're not just taking the ordinary thesis that people have and showing that that can't be really the case. But you're saying that the idea that something really is the case reduces to various absurdities. In other words, there's an enormous amount of weight now being put on the word really. There's an enormous amount of philosophical weight that this has to bear. So you can say this is a master argument, but the reply is, but what do you mean by really? I'm not sure that I ever really accepted that, or that I'm not talking in those terms. I understood Mr. Nagarjuna when he said vases exist, but you're not just saying that, you're saying vases really exist. You owe me an explanation of what is this idea of really is doing in it. And if that's the case, then we've got a master argument which in some sense is giving it an appearance of rigor, but is hiding the difficulties. Because the difficulties are switching now, not from finding a whole bunch of arguments, but are switching over to the problem of what are we actually refuting? What is this notion of things being really one thing or another that is being slipped into the premises and in the conclusions? And when you have that type of problem coming to the forefront, it produces quite a change in your Madhyamaka. Because you actually don't need very many arguments. You might have had 5 or so in the time of Kamalashila, but if you take certain Tibetan schools, especially the Gelugpa, who put a great deal of emphasis on this idea of identifying the object to be refuted, in fact, the argumentation that they themselves use in their so-called umetatri type of literature is very, very streamlined. It just comes down to the one and many argument. It turns into a 4-step procedure to arrive at voidness. And the big step in it is not the argumentation, but it is the starting point. In other words, identifying the object of refutation. That is what is taken to be subtle, and that is what's taken to be extremely difficult. And interestingly enough, that is approached not by using traditional Madhyamaka argumentation like you would find in Madhyamaka Karika, but much more by using introspection, thought experiments, phenomenological analyses, as a way of kind of teasing out the idea of what is to be refuted. Because, of course, the idea is that the point that a Gelugpa will make is that the idea of what is to be refuted is unfortunately not clear to us at all. It has to be teased out. Now, what kind of argumentation do you have then? Well, of course, I said you had a streamlined argumentation, but in fact, you have room for a whole different type of Madhyamaka, which doesn't look like the 20-some-odd chapters of the Madhyamaka Karikas, but which looks much more like a kind of phenomenological analysis, or perhaps something like from the philosophical investigations, teasing out certain ideas. I'm reminded in this particular case of Wittgenstein's in the case of the private language argument, when he's talking about following a rule, of course he's faced with an opponent, in a sense himself, who has the idea that not just do we follow rules like add to, which is of course a banal fact, but that in a sense somehow all the results of add to are already contained, are already implicitly there in the rule. That is, there is a type, what he called a superlative fact about the matter, not just our practice of calculations and arithmetic and our going to the grocer's and so forth. And Wittgenstein has an enormous problem of teasing this out. He sees that this is where the subtlety is, because he imagines very well, and he says, but isn't there a determinate result when I say add to? In other words, doesn't that determine which way the whole series of numbers will go? And Wittgenstein has to say yes, but not with that superlative fact, you see? And so making the separation between, in a sense, what's to be conserved and what's to be refuted, whether we're dealing with Wittgenstein or, in the case of the Madhyamaka, then becomes a very, very subtle point and is not going to be answered simply by giving, in a sense, a proof, one of the 5 ways or something like that. So I think, to sort of start to wind this down and wrap it up, I think one thing that we can see with this quantity of argumentation, that is the decreasing quantity, is that also the type of argumentation is fundamentally changing. That's another way of saying that also the Madhyamaka philosophies are changing and are evolving. Are they improving? That's another debate. Of course, any commentator like Tsongkhapa or others will have to do his commentarial duties. In other words, can't just simply say, I don't care about the Madhyamaka argumentations. No, he will, and does, write commentaries like Rikpe Gyatso, in which he will add all the qualifiers necessary and will try to make sense of all the arguments in the root text. Of course, he couldn't do otherwise as a commentator. But I think that in an important sense, if we look at the way, for example, that a Gelugpa Madhyamaka teacher will teach Madhyamaka nowadays, or when he writes his own text, it's in a streamlined form. And it's in a streamlined form not just because it's Reader's Digest, in other words, it's some kind of Nagarjuna for dummies, but because things have changed. The emphasis has changed fundamentally. And the emphasis has changed to an understanding of what's the point of departure. In other words, what are we refuting? And that's a different type of Madhyamaka. That would be a very different type of Madhyamaka that one would write, if one were to write a Madhyamaka treatise, from the 20-some-odd chapters of the Mula Madhyamaka Karakas. The question of how to read Madhyamaka for a philosopher becomes, in a sense, much easier when you admit that there are changes. It's a relief, because otherwise you're stuck with it, in a sense, a kind of Procrustean bed when you're trying to put Nagarjuna into Tsongkhapa's type of framework, and you want to have a complete identity. Actually, it's a tough slog. It's a tough slog, not just because there are so many extra words added to the text, but because a lot of the arguments lose their elegance. It's not just a matter of wordiness, but in a sense it becomes harder to follow. If we're dealing with, to go to the vision argument and so forth, if we're dealing with, in a sense, Nagarjuna, the way I presented him at first, it's not so hard to see how this type of argumentation works, how this certain type of opportunism works. You can see it also in terms of the scientific theories, the physical knowledge of the day. And in fact, in many respects, that argumentation, which actually does all the way go through to the tattva samgraha and so forth, concerns quite recognized, it ends up dealing with quite recognizable issues like magnetism and things like that. In other words, magnetism ends up being given as an example of action at a distance. And then we get epistemological issues. No, there is a force that goes between the magnet and the object. You just can't see it. And then and so on. But these are, in a sense, understandable and recognizable in an historical context. On the other hand, if you take all that argumentation and you start putting the weight, or you start, in a sense, transforming it by adding the gakcha to every premise and every key step in the argument, then it's not clear as to how it's working. It's not very clear, and it's not very clear as to why we would be doing it or even have to do it. So, yes, it makes a difference. I think there's a kind of relief in admitting historical changes rather than being forced to impose a very interesting later reading on the earlier text. I mean, it's interesting in itself, the idea of speaking of really, in fact, and so forth, and having this problem of the identification of the gakcha. But in a certain sense, it makes for inelegant arguments.